My wife was standing calmly in our doorway, doing nothing more than protecting her home and following the law, when a man pretending to be an HOA officer showed up uninvited, demanded entry without a warrant or any real authority, became aggressive when she refused, and crossed a line that made neighbors freeze in shock. Phones come out to record, and voices rise asking him to stop, because what he didn't know in that moment was that the woman he put his hands on was my wife, and I am the police chief. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. My wife was standing calmly at our front door, just protecting our home and following the law, when a man pretending to be an HOA officer showed up without warning, demanded to come inside even though he had no legal right, got aggressive when she said no, and went too far. Neighbors froze in shock, pulled out their phones to record, and shouted at him to stop, not knowing that the woman he touched was my wife, and I am the police chief. It started like any other quiet afternoon in a neighborhood where people waved to each other and kids rode bikes without fear, and my wife had just finished tidying the living room before stepping to the front door to get some fresh air. She was not expecting anyone, and there was no reason to be on guard because our home had never been a place of conflict or drama. The knock came sharp and impatient, not the polite tap of a neighbor but the kind that assumed authority before a word was spoken. When she opened the door, she saw a man she had never met standing too close to the threshold wearing a poorly fitted shirt with a generic logo and a badge clipped in a way that looked more theatrical than official. He did not introduce himself properly, and he did not ask how her day was going. He immediately began speaking about violations, inspections, and rules that he claimed gave him the right to enter our home. My wife listened because that is who she is, calm and respectful even when confronted by nonsense, but she also knew enough to recognize when something was wrong. She asked him to step back and explain why he was there in writing or to return later with proper notice. That simple refusal was all it took for his attitude to change. His voice grew louder, not because he was right, but because he wanted to be heard. He gestured wildly, pointing toward our home as if ownership could be claimed through confidence alone. He said the HOA did not need permission. He said refusal would result in fines. He said things that sounded rehearsed as though he had used them before and expected them to work every time. My wife remained steady, her hands still on the door, her voice even as she told him again that he was not allowed inside and needed to leave immediately. That was the moment when the situation shifted from uncomfortable to dangerous. Instead of stepping back, he stepped forward. Instead of lowering his voice, he raised it. He accused her of being difficult. He accused her of hiding violations. He accused her of thinking she was above the rules. The irony of that accusation would not be lost on anyone later, but in that moment it was simply alarming. Neighbors began to notice the raised voices, and curtains moved as people looked outside to see what was happening. My wife tried to close the door, but he placed his hand against it, stopping it from shutting. That single action changed everything. It was no longer a conversation. It was no longer a disagreement. It was an intrusion. A neighbor across the street stepped onto their porch. Another pulled out a phone. Someone shouted that he needed to back away. My wife told him firmly to remove his hand and leave, and for a brief second there was silence as if the street itself was holding its breath. Then he pushed. It was not a hard shove meant to send her flying, but it was deliberate, intentional, and meant to intimidate. My wife stumbled back a step, catching herself on the doorframe, her face shifting from calm to shock as she realized just how far this man was willing to go. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had formed. Someone yelled that he had no right to touch her. Another voice shouted that the police were being called. Phones were now fully raised, recording every second, capturing his posture, his expression, and the moment he realized he was no longer in control of the narrative. Instead of stopping, he doubled down. He began shouting about disrespect and authority, about how people like her needed to learn consequences. He had no idea that the words he was using were being preserved in high definition, or that each second he stayed there only made things worse for himself. My wife did not shout back. She did not strike him. She stood her ground, steady despite the adrenaline and fear, because she knew one simple truth that he did not. This was not a random house. This was not a powerless family. And this was not a mistake he could talk his way out of. As the crowd grew, so did the tension. Neighbors who had known us for years stood closer, protective and angry on our behalf. People who barely knew us still understood instinctively that something was wrong. The man's badge no longer impressed anyone. His words no longer carried weight. He was exposed, not by force but by witnesses. Somewhere in the middle of his shouting, someone made the call he never considered possible, the call that would turn his fake authority into a real problem. My phone rang shortly after, and the voice on the other end was urgent, shaking, and unmistakably serious. The address they gave was my own. What the man did not know, what he could not have imagined, while he was posturing in my doorway, was that every second he stayed there was building toward a moment that would define the rest of his day, and possibly his future. He believed he was enforcing rules. He believed he was untouchable. He believed fear gave him power. He was wrong. The man standing on our porch carried himself like someone who had practiced being intimidating, but not like someone who truly understood authority, and that difference showed in every exaggerated movement and every word that tried too hard to sound official. His badge was clipped at an odd angle, shiny but generic, the kind anyone could order online, and his uniform looked more like a costume than something earned through training, discipline, and accountability. He spoke quickly and loudly, not to communicate but to dominate, as if volume alone could turn fiction into fact. He claimed the HOA had unlimited power within the neighborhood, repeating the phrase as if saying it enough times would make it true. He talked about inspections, violations, and enforcement, stringing together legal-sounding words without understanding their meaning. When my wife asked for documentation, he brushed it off. When she asked for identification, he grew irritated. When she calmly told him he did not have permission to enter the home, he smirked, as if consent were optional when he was involved. That smirk told everyone watching exactly who he was. It was the look of someone who believed rules applied only to others. It was the look of someone who had gotten away with bullying before and expected to do it again. He leaned closer, invading personal space, lowering his voice in a way meant to feel threatening rather than respectful. He spoke about fines and penalties, about reporting us, about how difficult things could become if she did not cooperate. My wife did not raise her voice. She did not insult him. She did not flinch. She repeated the same sentence, clear and firm, telling him he needed to leave and that he was trespassing. Each time she said it, his frustration grew, because the one thing fake authority cannot tolerate is calm resistance. He wanted fear. He wanted submission. What he got instead was composure. Neighbors began to recognize what was happening. This was not enforcement. This was not procedure. This was a man playing dress-up and expecting obedience. Someone across the street muttered that real officers never act like this. Another neighbor pointed out that the HOA had no jurisdiction over private entry. The man heard them, and his face tightened, because his audience was no longer passive. He tried to regain control by escalating. He accused my wife of being uncooperative. He accused the neighbors of interfering. He accused everyone but himself, because admitting the truth would mean admitting he had no power at all. His voice cracked slightly when someone asked for his supervisor's name. He ignored the question when someone else asked which law allowed him to force entry. Instead of answers, he offered anger. He gestured sharply, his hands moving too fast, his body language aggressive and unstable. He told the crowd they did not understand the rules. He told my wife she was making things worse for herself. He told everyone that consequences were coming. What he did not realize was that consequences were already standing on the sidewalk, holding phones, documenting everything. Fake authority depends on isolation. It depends on silence. It depends on people being too afraid or unsure to challenge it. That illusion shattered the moment witnesses gathered. Every neighbor who stepped outside weakened him. Every phone camera stripped away another layer of confidence. The more he spoke, the more obvious it became that he was improvising, grasping for control he never truly had. My wife reminded him again that he needed to leave. She told him plainly that if he did not, the police would be called. He laughed at that, a short, dismissive sound meant to belittle the idea. He said the police would side with him. He said he worked with them. He said things that would later come back to haunt him in ways he could not yet imagine. There was a moment, brief but telling, when he looked around and realized no one was backing high. Up, no fellow officers, no supervisors, no authority of any kind. Just a man on a porch surrounded by witnesses, clinging to a role he could not defend. That realization did not make him stop. It made him reckless. He stepped closer again, pushing past the boundary he had already been warned about. He spoke through clenched teeth, his words sharp and personal now, no longer even pretending to be professional. That was the moment everyone understood this was no longer about rules. It was about ego. It was about a man who could not stand being told no. The power he thought he had was slipping away, and instead of letting go, he tightened his grip on the lie. He had no idea that every second he continued was being carefully recorded, not just by neighbors, but by fate itself. He believed authority was something you could claim. He believed fear was something you could manufacture. He was about to learn the difference between pretending to hold power and standing face to face with the real thing. The moment everything changed did not arrive with a siren or a shout, but with a single step forward that never should have been taken. Because up until that point, the situation, while tense, still carried the fragile possibility of ending with words instead of consequences. The man pretending to be an HOA officer had already overstepped social boundaries, legal boundaries, and basic human decency, yet there was still a chance he could walk away and leave behind nothing more than harassment and angry memories. That chance disappeared the instant he decided that intimidation was not enough and that physical presence would do what lies and volume could not. My wife felt it before anyone else saw it, that shift in the air that tells you something is about to go wrong. His shoulders squared, his stance widened, his voice dropped into something quieter but more dangerous, the kind of tone people use when they think they are about to win. She told him one last time to step back, her words clear and steady, not shouted, not emotional, but firm in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. The neighbors heard it. The phone's recording heard it. Even he heard it, but he chose to ignore it. When he moved closer, it was no longer about enforcement or rules or authority. It was about dominance. His hand came up, not in a dramatic swing, but in a calculated motion meant to invade space and assert control. The contact was brief, but it was unmistakable. He put his hands on my wife. That single act fractured the moment into before and after, turning a heated confrontation into something far more serious and far more permanent. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, and for a heartbeat no one spoke, as if everyone needed a second to process what they had just seen. Then the street erupted. Someone shouted his name, telling him to back off. Another voice yelled that he had no right to touch her. A neighbor stepped forward instinctively, placing themselves closer to my wife, not to escalate, but to protect. The phone stayed raised, steady hands capturing the exact second when everything crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. My wife took one step back, not out of fear, but to regain balance, and when she straightened, her expression was no longer just calm, it was resolute. She did not cry out. She did not lash back. She stood there, grounded, surrounded by witnesses, and said words that carried more weight than shouting ever could. She told him to leave immediately and informed him that he had just committed a crime. Her voice did not shake, and that unnerved him more than anger would have. For the first time since he arrived, uncertainty flickered across his face. It was brief, but the cameras caught it. He looked around and saw not a silent neighborhood, but a street full of people watching him closely. He saw phones aimed directly at him, not as threats, but as mirrors, reflecting back the reality of what he had done. Instead of backing down, he reacted the only way someone like him knows how when control slips away. He got louder. He began talking over everyone, insisting it was a misunderstanding, claiming he had been provoked, accusing my wife of being aggressive even though the footage clearly showed otherwise. His words tumbled over each other, contradicting themselves, changing shape as he tried to rewrite the moment in real time. The neighbors did not accept it. The phones did not accept it. Reality did not accept it. Someone in the crowd said they were calling the police, and instead of relief, the man laughed, a hollow sound meant to project confidence. He said he was not worried. He said he knew people. He said he had done nothing wrong. Each sentence sounded less convincing than the last, and the bravado he had arrived with was now cracking under the weight of evidence and witnesses. My wife stood silently while he spoke, because she did not need to defend herself. The truth was already doing that for her. Neighbors checked on her, asking if she was okay, and she nodded, thanking them, never taking her eyes off the man who had just made the worst decision of his day. The support surrounding her was quiet but powerful, a physical reminder that she was not alone and that his attempt at intimidation had failed completely. As minutes passed, the tension did not fade. It thickened. Every passing second added another layer of seriousness to what had happened. This was no longer a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over. This was an incident, a documented, witnessed incident involving physical contact, false authority and escalating behavior. The man sensed it too, and his movements became restless. He paced slightly, adjusted his badge, wiped his hands on his pants, small tells that revealed the confidence was gone. In that moment, the street itself felt different. The quiet neighborhood had transformed into a place of accountability, where actions mattered and excuses carried no weight. Children were ushered inside, adults stayed where they were. No one left, no one looked away. Everyone understood that what they were witnessing was important, not just for my wife, but for the principle that no one gets to pretend they are above the law. When the distant sound of approaching sirens finally reached the edge of hearing, the man stiffened. He stopped talking. He stopped pacing. He stood very still as if frozen, and for the first time since he arrived, he said nothing at all. The realization had settled in. This was no longer his stage. The story was no longer his to control. The moment everything changed had already passed, sealed by a single unlawful touch and dozens of recording lenses. And as the sound of real authority drew closer, one truth became unavoidable. Whatever he thought he was when he walked onto that porch, whatever power he imagined he held, it was gone, replaced by consequences that were already on their way. The call came in quietly, without drama or raised voices, but the weight of it was immediate and unmistakable, because there are certain tones you learn to recognize after years in law enforcement, and urgency wrapped in disbelief is one of them. The dispatcher did not waste time with pleasantries, and she did not exaggerate what she was saying, yet every word carried an edge that told me this was not routine. She gave the address first, and for a split second my mind rejected it, assuming I had misheard because it was too familiar, too close, too personal to be a coincidence. Then she repeated it. My address. She explained that a man claiming to be HOA enforcement had become aggressive, that there were multiple callers, that witnesses reported physical contact, and that video was already circulating among neighbors. She did not need to tell me more, because the pieces fell into place on their own, snapping together with a clarity that made my stomach tighten. This was not a call about a disturbance somewhere across town. This was not an abstract report I would review later. This was my home, my street, and my wife standing in the middle of a situation that never should have existed. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my desk. I simply stood up, already moving, already reaching for my keys, because instinct takes over in moments like that. Years of training tell you to remain calm, to assess, to proceed with intention, but being a professional does not erase being human. I acknowledged the call, informed dispatch I was en route, and ended the conversation without another word. The drive was short, but it felt longer, stretched by thoughts that kept pushing their way forward, despite my efforts to stay focused. I replayed what I knew of my wife's composure, her calm strength, her ability to stand firm without provoking conflict, and that knowledge reassured me even as anger simmered beneath the surface. I trusted her, but I did not trust the kind of man who pretends to have authority, because those are often the ones most willing to abuse it. As I approached the neighborhood, I noticed a change before I even turned onto our street. Cars were parked unevenly. People were standing outside instead of retreating indoors. Heads turned as my vehicle passed, and I could see recognition on their faces, not relief yet, but expectation. Word travels fast in a close neighborhood, especially when something crosses a line, and by the time I pulled closer, it was clear that this incident had already become a shared moment, witnessed and remembered by many. I did not arrive with sirens, and I did not rush in with unnecessary force. Authority does not need to announce itself loudly when it is real. I parked, stepped out, and took in the scene in a single glance, because reading a situation quickly and accurately is not optional when lives and trust are involved. I saw my wife standing near the doorway, supported by neighbors, her posture steady despite the tension still hanging in the air. I saw phones raised, some still recording, some paused but ready, and I saw him. The man stood apart, no longer loud, no longer posturing, his body language stiff and uncertain, as though he sensed the shift but had not yet fully understood it. His badge was still clipped to his belt, but it no longer looked impressive. It looked small, it looked ridiculous. He glanced in my direction, then away, then back again, and I watched the realization spread across his face in stages, like a slow moving shadow. I identified myself clearly and calmly, stating my name and my position, not as a threat, but as a fact. The effect was immediate. His shoulders dropped slightly. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again when no words came. The confidence he had worn so loudly minutes earlier was gone, replaced by something closer to fear, though he tried to mask it with a stiff nod and forced composure. I asked him to step back and keep his hands visible, and for the first time since arriving, he complied without argument. That alone told me everything I needed to know. People who believe in their authority argue, people who know they are exposed obey. I turned briefly to my wife, met her eyes, and asked if she was all right. She nodded, and that single gesture grounded me more than anything else could have. Neighbors began speaking at once, eager to explain what they had seen, what they had recorded, what had happened before I arrived. I did not interrupt them, because witnesses deserved to be heard, and because every voice added another layer of clarity to an already clear situation. The story they told was consistent, detailed, and backed by video, and as they spoke, the man's attempts to interrupt grew weaker and less frequent, until he fell silent altogether. When additional officers arrived, the process moved forward with precision and professionalism. Statements were taken, videos were collected, timelines were established. The man was informed of his rights, his earlier bravado replaced by a tight jaw and downward gaze. He tried once to explain himself, to frame his actions as a misunderstanding, but the evidence left no room for interpretation. A misunderstanding does not involve physical contact. A misunderstanding does not involve impersonation. A misunderstanding does not involve ignoring repeated warnings to leave. As the situation stabilized, the crowd began to thin, neighbors returning to their homes with a shared sense of closure and quiet satisfaction. They had seen something important that day, something that reaffirmed a simple truth, that authority is not a costume and that accountability applies to everyone, especially those who pretend otherwise. Phones were lowered, but the recordings remained, preserved reminders of how quickly abuse collapses under scrutiny. I stood there a moment longer, watching as procedure unfolded, not as a husband or a neighbor, but as someone sworn to uphold the law without exception. The man avoided my eyes now, his earlier certainty replaced by the understanding that his actions had consequences he could not escape. He had expected obedience. He had expected silence. What he got instead was exposure, witnesses, and the call he never imagined would be made. By the time it was over, the street was quieter, but it was not the same. Something had shifted, not just for him, but for everyone who had watched. The illusion he brought with him had been dismantled completely, and in its place stood the reality that power claimed without right collapses the moment it meets the truth. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the tension in the air shifted, though it was subtle at first, like the quiet before a storm, because the man who had so brazenly overstepped his bounds was still trying to convince himself that his authority was real, that he could maintain control simply through force, presence, and a badge he did not earn. He froze when he saw me, but only for an instant, and then he quickly masked it with an awkward, defensive posture that was clearly designed to hide fear, though it could not fully succeed. Every inch of his body language betrayed uncertainty, because deep down, he had always known that authority built on pretense and intimidation is fragile, and that the moment someone with real power confronts you, the illusion collapses quickly. I identified myself clearly, my voice steady and precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding, and the neighbors, many of whom had been watching silently with their phones raised, recording everything, immediately sensed the shift. Their murmurs of reassurance and whispered conversations filled the background, but none of them spoke too loudly, not because they feared me, but because they instinctively knew that real authority had arrived and that what came next would unfold in a controlled and measured way. The man's eyes flicked nervously from me to my wife, who stood at the doorway with composure that was remarkable. Under pressure, and then back to the crowd, as if trying to gauge how many witnesses there were and whether any of them might intervene physically. He quickly realized that all the evidence was already stacked against him, and that there was no escaping accountability. I instructed him in clear terms to step back, to remove his hands from his pockets, and to remain still. His shoulders tensed, his jaw tightened, and he glanced around, calculating whether to resist, to argue, or to flee. But none of those options were viable. Authority is not about volume, it is not about ego, and it is certainly not about empty threats. Authority is about the ability to act decisively within the boundaries of law and procedure, and I had that, fully prepared and ready to exercise it. He complied, though reluctantly, because his performance as a fake enforcer could not withstand the presence of someone who embodied true enforcement. He attempted to explain himself in halting words, claiming misunderstandings, procedural errors, or miscommunication, but every sentence he spoke contradicted the evidence already captured on neighbors' phones, on multiple cameras, and through dozens of eyewitness accounts. The real officers arrived shortly afterward, their presence calm but authoritative, filling the street with a silent assertion of law and procedure. They did not rush forward aggressively. There was no need. They moved methodically, professionally, like chess pieces guided by experience, surrounding the man and establishing control of the situation. They requested identification, they asked for compliance, and they documented the scene systematically, taking notes and photographs, recording statements, and carefully ensuring that no detail would be lost or overlooked. At this point, the man's bluster had faded entirely. He realized that performance alone could not protect him, and that the moment for excuses had long passed. I turned my attention briefly to my wife, acknowledging her strength with a small nod. She had handled herself impeccably, and her composure had not only protected her but had preserved the credibility of the situation for every witness present. Her courage had created a foundation on which real authority could act, and it was now clear that the man who had tried to bully and intimidate had no support, no shield, and no way to escape accountability. The street had transformed from a scene of potential chaos into a controlled environment, a place where procedure and law now dictated the flow of events, rather than fear and pretense. As statements were collected, the neighbors continued to watch respectfully, aware that they had witnessed something significant, though the gravity of the situation was anchored not in spectacle, but in fact. The man attempted to interject occasionally, trying to justify his actions or minimize the severity of the confrontation, but the officers trained to deal with such resistance guided him patiently back to silence, emphasizing compliance, legality, and consequence over argument. Every gesture, every word, reinforced the simple truth. Real authority is defined by knowledge, preparation, and restraint, not by threats, fake badges, or intimidation. What struck me most in those moments, as the man's story fell apart and the officers documented his violation, was the transformation in the neighborhood itself. The witnesses, who had initially stood in passive concern, now realized that accountability was tangible. They saw clearly that those who misuse perceived power are ultimately vulnerable, and that standing firm in truth and law ensures that justice has a chance to prevail. Their silence was not fear, it was reverence for the process, understanding that chaos could have continued without proper intervention, but that measured, legitimate authority restored balance. The man, who had arrived with overconfidence, now stood rigidly, his posture defensive, his voice subdued, his earlier bravado evaporated entirely. He had attempted to claim power through intimidation and appearance, but what he had failed to recognize was that law enforcement, true law enforcement, does not require display. It requires preparation, authority, knowledge, and the presence of mind to enforce the law while protecting those who are vulnerable. Every command, every instruction from the arriving officers reaffirmed the boundaries that he had ignored and reinforced the principle that power cannot exist without responsibility. I watched as the situation slowly concluded, the officers issuing clear directives, collecting statements, and ensuring that the legal process would follow. There was no spectacle, no excessive show of force, no unnecessary confrontation. The matter was handled with precision, reinforcing both the law and the rights of the people involved. The man's fake authority had dissolved completely, replaced with accountability, documentation, and the understanding that there would be consequences for crossing the line. The neighborhood, which had been tense and uncertain just moments earlier, now exhaled collectively, relieved that the escalation had been contained and resolved appropriately. As I finally stepped back, allowing the officers to finalize their work, the man's gaze met mine briefly, a mixture of defiance, fear, and resignation reflected in his eyes. He had learned too late the difference between pretended authority and real authority, between ego-driven intimidation and measured enforcement. The lesson had been painful and public, witnessed by multiple neighbors and recorded from every angle, ensuring that no claim of innocence could survive scrutiny. I did not need to speak further. The truth, the law, and the presence of legitimate authority had done everything that needed to be done. By the time the street returned to its usual rhythm, there was a quiet understanding among the neighbors, a subtle shift in perception. They had witnessed more than an incident. They had witnessed the demonstration of real authority in action, the way in which preparation, calm, and lawful enforcement can diffuse danger, restore order, and assert consequences without chaos. It was a lesson in law, community, and human behavior, and one that would remain vivid in everyone's memory far longer than the transient anger of the man who had tried to claim power. The incident concluded with documentation complete, statements taken, and all evidence preserved. The man was no longer a threat. He was now a subject of accountability. The crowd dispersed slowly, discussing what had occurred, some still shocked, others reassured, but all aware that the situation had been handled correctly, decisively, and fairly. The lesson was unmistakable. Authority, when grounded in law and executed with composure, cannot be challenged successfully by posturing or deception. The street eventually went quiet again, but the calm was not the same as it had been before. Something had shifted, something subtle yet unmistakable, like the weight of knowledge settling over everyone who had witnessed the events that unfolded earlier that day. The tension that had gripped neighbors' shoulders had been replaced by a different feeling, a collective understanding that rules exist for a reason, authority has limits, and courage in the face of intimidation carries consequences far beyond the immediate moment. People stepped back into their homes, but the awareness of what had happened angered in the air, like an invisible thread connecting every observer, every witness, and every participant in that confrontation. It was a lesson not spoken aloud, but one understood instantly. Pretense of power may command attention temporarily, but it cannot withstand the presence of truth, preparation, and real authority. I stood on the porch, looking over the scene, and reflected on the events as they had unfolded. My wife had remained composed, not because she was fearless in a vacuum, but because she understood the importance of principle and clarity in moments of confrontation. She had not raised her voice unnecessarily. She had not engaged in futile argument. She had relied on calm, deliberate communication, and her actions had set the stage for resolution in a way that mere anger or reaction could not have accomplished. The man who had tried to intimidate her was now facing consequences for his choices, but he had underestimated one fundamental truth: courage and calm resolve in the face of false authority amplifies real power. He had believed that a badge, whether real or fake, gave him control. But authority is validated not by appearance alone, it is validated by action, responsibility, and accountability. Neighbors trickled back outside, speaking quietly among themselves, comparing notes on what they had seen, and discussing how unusual it was to witness such a confrontation escalate and then resolve without injury. There was respect in their eyes for my wife, for the law, and for the principle that had guided every step of the interaction. Witnessing injustice is one thing, seeing it confronted appropriately is another, and this situation had taught them both lessons simultaneously. The lesson of personal responsibility, knowing the limits of one's authority, and the lesson of societal responsibility, stepping in when you witness wrongdoing, were intertwined in ways that no one present would forget. Each person had recorded moments of the incident on their phones, not as a form of entertainment, but as evidence of what happens when someone attempts to overstep legal and ethical boundaries. Those videos would serve as reminders, not just for the man involved, but for anyone in the neighborhood or beyond who might be tempted to believe that intimidation can replace law. Even as the man was escorted away by the officers, his demeanor had changed completely. The bravado he had carried so confidently was now replaced by resignation, anxiety, and the stark realization that pretense cannot outmatch real authority. Every step he took away from the scene carried the weight of this lesson. Actions have consequences. Decisions, particularly ones that attempt to manipulate or intimidate others, are never isolated. His attempt to assert dominance in a private home had been witnessed, recorded, and documented, and now it would exist as an immutable record. Authority, respect, and credibility are earned, not taken, and his failure to recognize this fundamental truth had turned him into a cautionary example for all who watched. I took a moment to reflect on the broader implications of the day's events. In communities, misunderstandings often arise and tempers flare, but they rarely escalate to the point of physical confrontation without a catalyst. That catalyst is almost always a person who misinterprets, manipulates, or exaggerates authority to achieve personal satisfaction, rather than uphold principles. When that happens, those around them have a choice: remain passive, intervene ineffectively, or respond decisively. The neighbors had intervened, even passively at first, by recording, questioning, and speaking up, and their actions reinforced that a community functions best when its members are attentive, aware, and willing to act responsibly. Their participation, even if small individually, had collectively prevented further escalation and ensured that the law could step in effectively. The lesson extended beyond the immediate confrontation. It was also about trust, discernment, and vigilance. People must recognize who truly holds authority and who merely pretends. They must understand that not everyone who presents themselves as an enforcer is legitimate, and they must be prepared to protect themselves and others when false authority attempts to intrude on personal rights or safety. The man's actions had demonstrated that appearances can deceive, that audacity can temporarily intimidate, but that ultimately truth, reparation, and lawful action prevail. Those who witness injustice, as neighbors had done, play a vital role in upholding standards and ensuring that accountability exists even in seemingly minor disputes. Their participation had been critical in turning a potential tragedy into a public lesson in law, responsibility, and courage. For my wife, the day reinforced her own strength, her judgment, and her ability to remain composed under extreme pressure. She had been tested, and her responses had not only protected her but had also preserved the integrity of the law and reinforced the principle that no one, no matter how loud, threatening, or deceitful, can override rights with intimidation. The lesson was tangible and immediate. Courage, composure, and adherence to principle create real power. Those who attempt to substitute bluster, fake authority, or aggression for knowledge and lawfulness will ultimately fail. It was a personal validation of values and training, and it would resonate not only with her, but with every witness who observed the events. As the crowd dispersed, conversations among neighbors reflected a mixture of relief, admiration, and reflection. They spoke about the importance of documenting incidents, remaining calm when faced with provocation, and understanding the difference between real authority and pretense. They noted how quickly a situation can escalate when one party misunderstands or exaggerates their own power, and how equally quickly it can be contained. When true authority intervenes appropriately. There was consensus that the day had taught more than one lesson, not just for the man who had caused trouble, but for the entire neighborhood. Each person walked away carrying a reinforced understanding of community, accountability, and vigilance. In the days that followed, the incident continued to resonate in quiet conversations and reflections. The man's actions and their consequences became a cautionary tale. Residents discussed the boundaries of authority and the importance of questioning credentials, reminding each other that no one has the right to violate personal space or laws without accountability. The event reinforced an essential truth about justice. Real authority is defined by action, knowledge, and ethics, while power assumed through fear, deception, or ego is temporary and fragile. Attempts to control others without legitimacy do not succeed. They only invite exposure and consequences. The most important lesson, though, was subtle yet profound. Authority is not about winning arguments or silencing opposition. It is about knowing the law, respecting boundaries, protecting the vulnerable, and acting decisively when necessary. People must learn to stand firm when confronted with threats, to document evidence when possible, and to call upon legitimate authorities when personal safety is at risk. The courage displayed by my wife, combined with the attention and support of witnesses and the timely response of law enforcement, demonstrated that truth, composure, and lawful action always prevail. It reaffirmed the principle that good decisions, grounded in law and ethics, not only protect those immediately involved but also create lasting examples of integrity for entire communities. By the end of the day, the street returned to its usual quiet, but it had changed. Those who had watched carried with them a renewed understanding of vigilance, authority, and responsibility. The man who had attempted to assert false power was gone, leaving behind only lessons, evidence, and a clear illustration of the consequences of overstepping boundaries. The incident would not be forgotten, because it had taught that courage, truth, preparation, and lawful authority are always stronger than deception, intimidation, and pretense. In the end, everyone who had witnessed, recorded, and supported the process knew that the good guys had indeed won, and that lessons learned under pressure often endure longer and more deeply than lessons taught calmly in a classroom or lecture.